everyone. Welcome. My name is Anisha Hardy. I am the Executive Director of Alabama Values, and I'm so glad that you are here with us this evening live for Been Banned, Disrupt Myths, Reclaim Truth. This is our Juneteenth briefing that gets right to the heart of what it means to fight for the truth in a time of erasure. And tonight also marks the official kickoff of our Been Banned series, a collection of events, tools, and conversations designed to challenge erasure and confront historical distortions. We know that that what gets taught, what gets told, and what gets remembered is never neutral, right? It's shaped by power. And I often say that who controls the narrative controls the power. And too often that power is rooted in white supremacy, patriarchy, and fear. And for generations, those in control have used textbooks, media, legislation, and even, silence as tools to erase our history, to sanitize our struggles and vilify like our joy, which we know that joy is an act of resistance, and they painted over, Black brilliance and twisted our narratives into something that sometimes is often unrecognizable. And today we see the same tactics playing out in book bans, anti-DEI legislation, and efforts to rewrite or outright erase Black contributions from public spaces. And so we also see it in the policing of language, like banning terms such as systemic racism or white privilege from classrooms and trainings, and penalizing, those who are continuing to acknowledge the lived experiences that exist, in our country, right? And these aren't just isolated acts. These are coordinated attempts to control what we know and what we value and who we are allowed to be. But we must continue to push back and to continue to name those systems, to call out the lies, and to reclaim our stories. Because when we control the narrative, we create new possibilities. Not just for how our stories are told, but for how justice and liberation shows up in the world around us. So you see, tonight isn't just about facts and figures. It's about reclaiming what has been oftentimes stolen, buried, and distorted, not just in our textbooks, but in our cultural memory. It's about, naming, systems that have tried to silence our truths, flatten the joy, and erase the rituals, the music, the celebrations that have kept us whole. And these systems haven't just attacked our history, they also targeted our imagination, our creativity, and our connection to one another. And so just think about the ways that Black folks gathered in Alabama for Jubilee or second line parades in New Orleans, right? These weren't just about music. It was about, acts of remembrance and survival and joy. And we see that same spirit in places like HBCU homecomings, where community pride and traditions, often collide. And we see it at the cookouts, right? Where generations gather to honor, legacy over food and music. And we even see it in the digital spaces, where Black creators remix culture and reclaim narrative and spread joy. All acts of resistance, y'all, rooted in self-definition. And these, they're not just cultural expressions. They are declarations, of existence in a world that has tried to erase us. And tonight, through memory and through truth telling, we're making it clear that, we won't be silenced. We won't forget. We are here to remember, to celebrate our history, and to reclaim the narrative. And that's why, this conversation matters. That's why Juneteenth matters, because this isn't just a celebration of freedom. It's a celebration of how our people have always chosen joy, creativity, and community in the face of, deep injustice. It's a reminder that the fight for truth and liberation is ongoing. And that is, and it's that part of the fight, is remembering our ancestors, how our ancestors carved out, spaces of celebration in spirit, even under oppression. And so truth in this context isn't just about accuracy. It's really about honoring the fullness of our legacy and living it, with intention and pride. And so, I am deeply honored to be in community tonight with, my sister, Dr. Kimberly Brown Pelham, whose scholarship reminds us that freedom has never been one-dimensional. She'll be guiding us through the rich and often overlooked history of Black celebratory traditions. The ways our ancestors used joy, gathering, music, and rituals as both resistance and refuge. Her work brings to light how people have always found ways to pursue freedom and joy, even when both were deemed out of reach. She is someone who has not only studied the truth, but carries it with, I often say, such a, grace and urgency and power. Her works really calls us to remember, to resist and to reclaim. So before, I bring Dr. Brown Pelham on, and before we dive in, I want to ask each of us to just ground ourselves, take a deep breath. Bring your full self into this space, even though we're in a digital space, right? But wherever you are, because this space is for truth telling. It's for, reckoning and remembering and reclaiming. Because this briefing is not about fear or anything. It's about joy. It's about freedom. And freedom starts with being honest about how we got here and bold with where we go next, about where we go next. And remembering that our ancestors laid a blueprint, not just for resistance, but also how to love, how to celebrate, how to build community, even in the harshest conditions. And they showed us that joy can be revolutionary, that, that culture can be a protector and armor, and that, truth telling for us is sacred. It's a sacred act of survival. So y'all, let's get into it. With that, I'm honored to bring, to invite Dr. Kimberly Brown Pelham to the stage. Hey, girl.
Hi.
Yes. So I am looking forward to you sharing with us and kicking off this Been Banned series. I'm going to exit stage left and let you get into it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I was telling my good friend here, Perfect, that sometimes I'm a 70-year-old when it comes to tech, but it looks like you guys can see my slides. So that's a great thing. Before I begin, I want to offer my sincere thanks to Professor Anisha Hardy and the Alabama Values team for creating the space for the conversation and for inviting me to be a part of it. We knew each other in elementary school, and look at us just a few years later, reconnecting and shaking this narrative world up together. Is really cool and feels amazing to see the imprint you're making. So again, thank you. I want to start by mentioning a conversation that I had with my very, very, very close friend today, Dr. Arlisha Norwood, who happens to specialize in Civil War and emancipation history. Good for me. She's also homegrown in Texas. And she and I were chatting per usual. And I shared with her the potential first slide for my presentation. And I called it out because what I had was a red, white, and blue flag. And I'm like, absolutely not for Juneteenth, right? Because if you are familiar with the aesthetics of liberation, you know that it's supposed to look like red, green, and black. And Dr. Norwood tells me that I'm actually incorrect. Because there is an official Juneteenth flag that was designed in 1997 by activist Ben Haith. And the colors of the actual Juneteenth flag reflect the American flag. It's red, white, and blue. And Mr. Haith used these colors to specifically communicate that Black folks are American citizens. And his 5-point star is a symbol for Texas. And Texas, of course, is where the Juneteenth holiday started. And he added the larger star to symbolize the dissemination of the news of freedom. So what's the lesson that I learned today in talking to Dr. Norwood? If you want to know about Texas things, then it's best to consult somebody from Texas. And I share that as a prompt to one of the things that I'll be discussing in the next few minutes, and that is the essentiality of local placemaking and understanding the complexity and contours of history and culture. And I just want to say that Professor Hardy and I are so in sync with one another that I feel like she looked at my notes prior to, because again, I'll be talking about some of the things that she's already mentioned, which is the importance of local placemaking and recognizing the ways in which Black folks engage in joy all of the time, right? So your homecomings, family cookouts, etc. So stole a little bit of my thunder, but that's all right. When we speak about Juneteenth as this reference point for Black celebratory tradition and self-regard, which is this philosophy that I'm working through, we are not only considering a single holiday. We're talking about a long-standing practice in Black communities, marking time, memory, and identity through locally rooted celebrations. These rituals and practices, these folk customs, emerged not because we were granted permission to gather, but because African descent folk simply decided to do so. Growing up in Montgomery, Alabama, I experienced very early on that the Turkey Day Classic was the event that marked the Black holiday season, not Thanksgiving, right? Long before national retailers kind of caught on to this trend of Black culture, Black Montgomeryans were gathering by the thousands at Crampton Bowl to see Alabama State face off against Tuskegee. And the ante was up when you had families, and I thought I was unique, right? In that I had a family with folks who were Tuskegee graduates and some who were Alabama State graduates. So that certainly heightened the excitement, right? And as I got older, I realized that was very common for Black people to have family members attached to both schools because of geography, right? It wasn't just a football game. It's been in existence now for over 100 years, and it was the crown jewel of Black college classics. I'll show you guys a photo of Muhammad Ali actually attending one of these Turkey Day Classics, I believe in 1966. And so that just gives you a sense of how incredibly important Turkey Day Classic was to the culture of Black Montgomery, especially in a city that in so many ways has been shaped by slavery, race, and the outcomes of the Civil War. So here we are, 100 years later, you have Muhammad Ali in the center of that, right? Families planned meals around Turkey Day Classic. Students rehearsed for the halftime show with the kind of seriousness reserved for national events, okay? Turkey Day was Black Thanksgiving, one centered not on pilgrim mythology, but on community and collective interest. Same thing was very much so true for MLK Day parades I witnessed as a kid. Montgomery was another extension of how the local or the locality, if you will, shapes the culture. Montgomery being the birthplace of the movement, those parades were not ceremonial afterthoughts that the governor had to approve, the president of the United. No, they were full-on expressions of a people owning their civil rights and movement geography. And because so many of those who initiated the events of the civil rights movement in the 40s, 50s, and 60s were the ones who produced these MLK parades, it was natural for them to recognize the importance of commemoration. Schools marched, step teams performed, Black fraternities and sororities showed up in force. You've seen them. Particularly if you're from the South, you know what these things look like. It was the community's way of expressing this land is our land and this story is our story. Furthermore, these events were never just about Dr. King. They were about Black Montgomery that raised him from sort of start out preacher to global civil rights icon. These are the people that protested with him, raised money for him, resisted with him. And so they continued and continue to celebrate each other long after his assassination. Once again, the local matters because I grew up in a state whereby we can at least lay claim to the largest number of HBCUs. Montgomery wasn't the only place that had a classic. I remember the buzz around Magic City Classic in Birmingham. These are still huge events. I don't know if they still have Gulf Coast Classic, but that was a big thing that my family and I traveled to frequently. So whether it was Alabama A&M or Alabama State or other HBCUs facing off in their own homecomings, these events were drawing crowds, alumni, entire family caravans. They've been economic engines and cultural cornerstones. For Black folk, again, it didn't take any kind of formal act from outside of the community for it to be real, okay? There's no formal declaration other than the one that we declare for ourselves. We forget that Mardi Gras in Mobile predates the New Orleans version. As a child visiting family there, I didn't fully grasp the historical magnitude. I just knew that what I saw and what I felt was unmistakably Black. The music, the energy, social clubs, there was an elegance and a joy that really couldn't be mistaken. And later, I learned about the Black masking traditions, the contributions of the Black Creoles, and the influence of African and Caribbean aesthetics embedded in the earliest Mardi Gras societies. It taught me that American celebrations, even in their most public and elaborate forms, oftentimes maintain a Black foundation, one which is shaped by locality and the creativity of Black folks there. At church, many of you who may have grown up in the Black church, Black History Month was treated with such serious gravity, right? Even before I understood the origins of Negro History Week or Carter G. Woodson, I saw elders in my community curating skits, readings, programs, to make sure that children specifically knew where we had come from. Now, I go to FAMU, and I was introduced to another layer of the significance of local tradition, right? I thought Turkey Day was the classic. Once I got to Tallahassee, Florida, I understood what the Florida Classic meant to Black Floridians. FAMU and Bethune-Cookman, how in Tallahassee, I was also introduced to the importance of May 20th as Florida's Emancipation Day, commemorating the date in 1865 when Union General Edward McCook read the Emancipation Proclamation in Tallahassee, which effectively ended slavery in that state. And so this is me encountering these ideas that not every state commemorated freedom the same way. While current national understanding often begins and ends with Juneteenth, freedom became reality at different times and was claimed in different ways depending on the location. Later, I started teaching at Texas Southern University. I came to understand Juneteenth more fully. In Houston, I saw how Emancipation Park, I was amazed the first time I went. And I learned that it was purchased in 1872 by formerly enslaved people. So it's not just this site of memory, but it's a site of Black autonomy, Black folks making the decision for themselves to buy this land. It does not require outside voice or approval. Black folks decided this is something that is important to us, and this is how we will express that belief in buying this land. So knowing that helps us to grasp that Juneteenth, like all of these traditions, can't fully be understood outside of place. Its meaning lives in the region that birthed it. So when we think about how Black communities celebrate freedom, we must consider where that freedom was declared or delayed or in many cases denied. We must recognize that our commemorations have always been shaped by local traditions, community memory, and regional expressions. Whether it's Montgomery, Tallahassee, Mobile, Houston, Black folks have always created these rituals of self-regard that reflect our evaluations of ourselves and the intercommunal conversations we're having with one another about how we choose to remember, as a reference for moving forward on this map of human geography. Shout out to John Henry Clark for the language. For those of you who know, you know. Black communities often demonstrate affinity for their local origins, right? Through very clear place-based cultural practices. So including referencing area codes, 404, 313. You've heard them in the hip hop songs, name dropping neighborhoods or housing projects, wearing jackets and shirts featuring city names and high schools, and emphasizing regional foodways. So your New Orleans crawfish boils, your Memphis barbecues, right? These gestures are more than stylistic. They function as forms of geographic identity, signaling belonging, memory, rootedness. In a country where Black presence has often been erased or displaced, these practices really ground identity in specific landscapes and histories. So now, as we reflect on Juneteenth, not only as a celebration, but as a geographical and cultural reference, it's an anchor for how Black people, specifically in Texas, commemorated freedom. And to dive into that in the most appropriate way, the grounding is the Civil War. It's important for us to understand that the Civil War was about slavery. Okay. It was not about vague notions of Southern culture, economic differences, or the banner of states' rights that folks like to cling to. The right at hand, the right that Southerners fought and died for, was the right to own other human beings. So those were the state rights that we're talking about. So slavery was the issue, no matter how folks want to put it. The Southern states seceded, of course, from the Union to protect the institution of slavery from perceived threats. And they said so plainly in their declarations of secession. Texas, for instance, explicitly cited the threat of federal government interfering with their right to maintain slavery as a justification for their withdrawal. And you have to think about what's happening in 1861 at the time. The United States had grown from this sort of coastal experiment as Britain's babies, right? Now we've grown into a nation with imperial ambitions stretching westward, want to take more land and continue to attain power throughout the world. Slavery was not just a Southern issue. It was a national economic engine shaping commerce, labor, political compromise across borders. In Texas specifically, which operated as a frontier of white expansion, slavery is deeply entrenched, right? It was defended with extraordinary violence and woven into the state's foundational identity. Historian Annette Gordon-Reed has a book called On Juneteenth, which is probably one of the most seminal texts about this topic. Talks about this tendency for folks to characterize Texas as Southern but different. And the reality is that Texas had deep investments in slavery. And after the war, it emerged as a site of sustained racial terror. Black political and social progress during Reconstruction was met with backlash. White supremacist violence, political disenfranchisement, legal suppression, all of those things occurred in Texas. And it intensified, this anti-Black hostility found across the entire Confederacy, okay? It was in this context that Juneteenth is born, okay? One myth that I think is important to talk about that folks immediately go to when bringing up Juneteenth is that Black Texans simply waited to be freed. They are unaware. They are dependent on Union troops to provide freedom for them. The truth is that Black Texans, like Black people across the South, engage in acts of resistance long before General Granger arrives in Galveston. Enslaved folks are slowing down their labor. They are pretending to be ill. They are sabotaging farm equipment. And some are outright fleeing their plantations. All of this is documented and known about the period prior to the Civil War. Moreover, Black people contribute directly to the war effort. By the time we do get to these bloody 4 years that begin in 1861, you have over 200,000 Black folks serving in the Union Army and Navy. And as we talk about the importance of locality, you see there the gates of the African American Civil War Museum in DC. Okay, so that is a local treasure that helps to shape the history and culture there. And these men weren't just soldiers, they were engineers, cooks, nurses, women, Black women, spies, scouts, laborers, who helped build the physical and strategic infrastructure of Union victory. We know that during the first 2 years of the Civil War, and victory for the Union does not appear to be very likely because the North just doesn't have the same kind of interest or investment in slavery in the way that the South does. Harriet Tubman herself leads intelligence gathering missions and even directed a raid in South Carolina that freed hundreds. On top of this, Black women are nursing the wounds and gathering intelligence, often sort of moving unnoticed through both Union and Confederate lines. Enslaved people in Confederate states are passing along critical information to Union soldiers about terrain, troop movement, supply lines. These actions were deliberate, and it required an intense level of intelligence and creativity. Black people were not on the sidelines of history. They were central to dismantling the Confederacy. Black people not knowing they're free, again, until June 19th, 1865 is not true. Word of the emancipation had already spread before Granger gets to Galveston. The news is traveling by Black sailors, Union troops, migrating freed people, and even the enslavers themselves, right? You have to understand that somebody is in the kitchen overhearing your conversation, right? Many enslaved Texans were aware of Lincoln's 1863 proclamation 2 years earlier. But they also understood that knowing and being able to act on that knowledge was two different things. White enslavers in Texas were protected by the state's geographic distance from the battle lines, and they deliberately withheld news of emancipation, which prolonged their exploitation of Black labor. Some enslavers moved to Texas from deeper southern states, hoping to escape the reach of the Union Army and continue enslaving people without disturbance. So this myth of they didn't know really, unfortunately, feeds another myth of Black ignorance. Finally, it's essential to disrupt this notion that Juneteenth represents a singular moment when slavery ended in the United States. Juneteenth commemorates the announcement of General Order Number 3 by General Granger, but not necessarily the end of slavery. Slavery continues in other states as well. Shout out to Delaware and Kentucky. They remain slaveholding states until the passage of the 13th Amendment in December of that same year, so 6 months further out. Even in Texas, the implementation of Granger's order varied depending on the county, right? And as I said earlier, you have to have enforcement to make it real. So I don't care what announcement you bring, if the Union Army is not there to enforce this new law, it's not for naught, right? So you have outright resistance of planters to acknowledge this new reality that really disrupts the white Southern way of life. So Juneteenth, while it's a powerful marker, it's not a clean break from bondage. It reminds us that freedom was not simply declared, it had to be fought for, claimed, and protected through action and collective will. The gap between law and lived reality remains a key theme in the Black freedom tradition. Now, when we talk about the optics of Juneteenth, they often appear leisurely, right? We see the cookouts, music, card games, casual gatherings, but it's important to know that the aesthetics are intentional. Maybe we come in with coordinated outfits, curated menus, parade processions, ceremonial programming. These elements reflect an enduring value system rooted in self-regard and public-facing pride. Much of this, however, is not aimed at external validation. Okay, my church is having our Juneteenth celebration this Sunday, and I don't think anybody there is looking for coverage from the New York Times. Okay, this is an intercommunal conversation that we are experiencing for ourselves. Okay, Again, parades, music, ceremonial dress, and public performance are all a part of it. And it's not incidental. They are structured, intentional expressions of self regard and self definition. And a big part of what you see with Juneteenth is Miss Juneteenth. And this queen motif is really important. It offers a direct counter narrative to dominant stereotypes that have historically misrepresented Black women. This pageant structure helps to reclaim image making through, again, internal community standards. And that can vary for Black folks, right? That can be because she's attractive, or it could be, the contest stipulates she has to have the highest GPA. I got Best Baby Award at my church a few years ago because my mama sold the most fish plates, right? So it doesn't fit within this standard white framework of what pageantry can look like. Self-regard is the foundation upon which Black communities have built memory, celebration, resistance. We've never needed permission to honor our dead, to crown our daughters, to have the fish fry. Okay. Long before Juneteenth was recognized by the federal government, Black people had already named, claimed, and ritualized their own days of freedom without outside acknowledgement. I just want to give you a few examples of that before we close. We have Memorial Day, which traces back to Black folks in Charleston who, at the end of the Civil War, decided that it was important to them to give proper burial and public recognition to Union soldiers who had died fighting for their freedom. Black communities established Emancipation Days with their own timelines: May 20th in Florida, January 1st in South Carolina, August 8th in Kentucky and Tennessee, November 1st in Maryland. Black History Month, never simply a government-sanctioned month, right? It began as Negro History Week, founded by Dr. Woodson in 1926 out of necessity, our own necessity to correct the record. His Negro Bulletin, created to teach our children what textbooks refuse to say and to institutionalize an intellectual legacy. Even now, whether the state acknowledges it or not, whether school boards distort or dilute, Black churches, HBCUs, community centers, and families will keep teaching this history. It's literally not up to the White House. We have our boots on the ground in more than one way, or as my grandmother used to put it, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think it's important to recognize what slavery did have the power to destroy, but also what it did not. So it stole labor, it stole time, lineage, it broke up families, it tried to suppress belief, but it could not kill imagination, it couldn't kill our humanity or joy, and it couldn't erase memory. It could not touch the will of African Americans who have always known how to gather, how to make meaning, and how to look at each other in the face and say, we are important, right? To borrow the phrase, Black Lives Matter, okay? That is a conversation we have been having with ourselves for a very, very long time. And I think that is what self-regard is about, honoring your own humanity. And so I hope that this Juneteenth season, everyone is inspired by that legacy. Shout out to Opal Lee, who was just an active citizen from the great state of Texas, maybe, who, committed for many, many years to making Juneteenth a federal holiday. And it is directly because of her work, her own agency, that we see Joe Biden sign it into law. She, in my mind, is self-regard and proof that we can be choreographers of history and not just victims or observers of it. And finally, I'll just share with you guys a few resources for further study if you are interested. I mentioned the book on Juneteenth earlier for a bit more serious or heavier read. And then these two titles for kids are personal favorites in my household: The History of Juneteenth by Dr. Arlisha Norwood, and the book Juneteenth. Lastly, Dr. Greg Carr is always an amazing resource on all things Africana, and he and the Zen Education Project have an audio lesson on Juneteenth and Reconstruction. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. No, thank you so much, sis. Look, well, first, I just want to thank you for leaning in the way that you do. I said you do it with such clarity and such urgency in how you talk about the history. And, the conversation was rich, and not just because of the history that was uncovered. And I learned so much. Like, I'm always learning, right? We're always learning, right? Even as we teach, we're always learning. But I think, and so not just about what was uncovered, but because of the energy and intentionality, that you brought right into the space. And I think what we're doing here and what Ben Band is rooted in, is rooted in this deep intentionality to lift up the legacy of our ancestors, to honor, the blueprints. Like I said before, like they left a blueprint that was left for us, and to build on these traditions that sustain through, through struggle, joy, and vision. And so, we don't gather just to remember, but we gather to carry forward. And that's all I can think about as you were showing, as I was looking at the slides. And so we opened tonight talking about reclaiming what's been buried. And now, as we close, like I want to remind us that the work doesn't stop here. If anything, it starts here. And that, the Ben Band, series is just getting started. And over the coming, for the remainder of the year, Alabama Values, in partnership with the history consultants and Dr. Kimberly Brown Pelham, will be hosting more community-centered events, developing tools for folks who want to learn and who wants to share, right? Content that really lifts up the truth that has been silenced. And we invite, everyone to stay connected and to be a part of this work. So here are a few ways that you can take action tonight. One, join our mailing list. You can do so by visiting our website, Alabama Values. That's www.alvalues.org. Follow us on social media. That's where you can get all the latest drops of what's happening, and where you will also find, this content. Also share what you learned here tonight, with someone in your life, whether it's over dinner, at your kitchen table, or if you eating on the go in the car on the passenger side, whether it's in the group chat, on social media. Keep the conversation going. Also, tap in with the history consultants. And you can visit thehistoryconsultants.com to learn more about their work. Also, support orgs like ours that is doing this work. If you believe in the power of narrative to transform communities and to push back against erasure, consider making donations to these organizations so that we can keep series and content like this going. But also, invite us in. If you are part of an organization, a school, a community group that wants to explore, these narratives, reach out. We'd love to collaborate. Let's not let this moment fade. Let it be momentum, and let's build upon this idea of truth telling, joy making, and future shaping. Because what's been banned, we're reclaiming, y'all, and what's been distorted, we're correcting, and what's been forgotten, we are remembering together. I call it the idea of just like collective memory. And so I just want to thank you all for tuning in. I encourage you to stay bold, stay joyful, stay rooted, and remember, our ancestors left a blueprint, and we're here to follow it. So thank you all so much. Bye.